A single Catholic nun stands alone in the middle of a dirt road in Poland, 1945. In front of her, rumbling forward with the mechanical certainty of death itself, a German Panzer tank, 30 tons of steel and hatred, manned by battle-hardened SS soldiers who had spent years crushing everything in their path. She doesn't run. She doesn't hide. She pulls out a rosary, drops to her knees, and begins to pray. And here's the part that defies everything we know about war, about logic, about the iron rules of Nazi occupation. The tank stops. Not because of a mechanical failure, not because of orders from above. It stops because the men inside, men who had burned villages and executed civilians without hesitation, refuse to move forward. They sit there, engines idling, looking at this woman on her knees with nothing but wooden beads in her hands, and something breaks inside them. By the end of this video, you're going to know the real story behind one of the most mysterious moments of World War II, a moment the history books conveniently forgot, and you're going to understand why the most powerful weapon that day wasn't made of metal. Poland, April 1945. The war is in its final, ugliest days. The Third Reich is collapsing, but that doesn't make the Nazis less dangerous. It makes them desperate, vicious, willing to burn everything on their way down. The Red Army is pushing from the east. American and British forces are closing from the west. And caught in between in the blood-soaked countryside of occupied Poland are millions of civilians who have survived 6 years of hell and are now facing the most dangerous moment of all, the retreat. Because when an army retreats, when soldiers know they've lost, that's when the real atrocities happen. That's when the executions become random, when villages get torched just because they're there, when mercy dies completely. The roads are clogged with refugees, families carrying whatever they can, trying to stay ahead of both armies. The Nazis are blowing up bridges, destroying supplies, making sure the Soviets inherit nothing but ash. And in the middle of this chaos, in a small convent on the outskirts of a town whose name most maps have forgotten, a group of nuns are trying to do the impossible, protect the innocent. These weren't warrior nuns from some fantasy story. They were teachers, nurses, women who had taken vows of poverty and service, who spent their days in prayer and their nights tending to the sick. Most of them had never left Poland. Many had never even left their province. They wore simple black habits, ate meager meals, and believed that faith could move mountains, though none of them had ever actually tested that belief against a Panzer division. Their convent had become a refuge, a last sanctuary for orphans, for Jewish families in hiding, for anyone desperate enough to knock on their door. The Nazis knew. Of course they knew. But for reasons no one could fully explain, they had let the convent stand, a strange pocket of mercy in an ocean of brutality, until that April morning when mercy ran out. The commander of the local SS unit received his orders: evacuate the area, destroy anything of value, leave nothing for the Soviets. The convent was on the list, not because it was strategic, not because it posed any threat, but because it existed, and existence was no longer permitted. A squad was dispatched, 3 vehicles, 15 men, 1 Panzer tank, because in 1945 the Nazis still had enough fuel and enough spite to send a tank to destroy a building full of unarmed women. The nuns knew they were coming. Word had spread through the underground resistance, whispered from farmer to priest to convent door. They had maybe 2 hours. Some of the younger nuns wanted to run, to scatter into the forest with the children and take their chances. But the Mother Superior, a woman in her 60s who had lived through the First World War and knew exactly what soldiers did to refugees on the road, made a different choice. They would stay, they would pray, and if God willed it, they would bear witness. Sister Józefa Kaliska was 32 years old. She had joined the convent at 18, drawn by a calling she could never fully put into words, just a quiet certainty that her life belonged to something larger than herself. She taught children to read, helped deliver babies in the village, and spent hours each day in the chapel, rosary beads moving through her fingers like a lifeline to heaven. She was not remarkable. She was not a mystic or a visionary. She had never performed a miracle, never heard the voice of God in any way more dramatic than the gentle pull of conscience. She was, in every measurable way, ordinary, which is what makes what happened next so extraordinary. Because when the sound of tank treads began echoing down the road that morning, when the other nuns herded the children into the cellar and braced for the end, Sister Józefa Kaliska walked out the front door, rosary in hand, and stepped directly into the path of history. The Panzer came around the bend and she was there waiting, alone, kneeling, praying, and the war for one impossible moment held its breath. The tank commander saw her first through the observation slit, a dark shape in the road that his brain initially registered as debris, maybe a fallen tree or an abandoned cart. But as the Panzer closed the distance, the shape resolved into something that made no tactical sense whatsoever, a woman kneeling, not moving directly in their path. His first instinct was to simply roll over her. This was April 1945. The Eastern Front had taught him that hesitation got you killed. Mercy was a luxury that died somewhere between Stalingrad and Warsaw. He had seen children used as human shields, old women hiding grenades under their skirts, priests who turned out to be partisan spotters. Trust nothing. Assume everyone is the enemy. That was the only reason he was still alive. But something about this woman, about the way she knelt there with her hands clasped and her head bowed, made him signal the driver to slow down. Not stop, just slow down. Give her a chance to move. Give her a chance to run. She didn't run. As the Panzer rumbled closer, close enough now that the crew could feel the ground shaking beneath them, close enough that the engine roar would have been deafening to anyone standing outside, she remained perfectly still. Her lips were moving. The commander could see that now through the viewing slit. She was praying, or maybe pleading. It didn't matter. The road had to be cleared. The convoy behind them couldn't afford delays. The Soviets were maybe 12 hours away, maybe less, and every minute wasted here was a minute closer to encirclement, to capture, to the revenge that awaited any SS soldier unlucky enough to fall into Russian hands. The commander gave the order to proceed. The driver shifted gears. The tank lurched forward, and the woman, this stubborn, foolish woman, still did not move. Inside the tank, the crew was beginning to realize what was about to happen. They had run over obstacles before, cars, barricades, once even a horse that had panicked and bolted into their path. The Panzer didn't care. 30 tons of German engineering crushed everything equally. But this was different. This was a person, a woman, someone who had chosen to be here, who had looked at their tank and decided that whatever she was doing, whatever she was praying for, was worth dying for. The gunner, a young man from Bavaria who had lied about his age to enlist and now regretted every single choice that had led him to this moment, turned to the commander and asked if they were really going to do this. The commander didn't answer. He was staring at the woman, at the small wooden cross dangling from her clasped hands, catching the pale April sunlight. His mother had owned a rosary like that. She had prayed with it every night before bed, her lips moving in the same silent rhythm he was watching now through the viewing slit. The driver's foot hovered over the accelerator. 10 meters separated the tank from the kneeling nun. Then 8. Then 5. The engine growled, hungry, indifferent. The commander opened his mouth to give the final order, the one that would end this absurd standoff and get them back on schedule. But the words wouldn't come. Something had lodged in his throat, something that felt uncomfortably like shame, like the last shred of humanity he thought he had burned away years ago. He had killed before. He had killed many times. He had followed orders that made his stomach turn and his hands shake. But this somehow was different. At 3 meters, with the tank's shadow falling over Sister Józefa Kaliska, like the hand of God or the shadow of death depending on which side of the armor you stood, the commander made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered the driver to stop. Not to go around, not to reverse. Just stop. And in the sudden silence that followed, with the engine idling and the entire convoy waiting behind them, and the war still raging in every direction, 15 German soldiers sat frozen inside their vehicles, staring at one unarmed Polish nun, and wondered what the hell they were supposed to do next. The standoff lasted 7 minutes, though to everyone involved it felt like hours. Sister Józefa remained on her knees, rosary clutched in her hands, eyes closed, lips moving in continuous prayer. She was reciting the Hail Mary over and over, the words flowing automatically after 14 years of daily devotion, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. She was thinking about the children in the cellar, 43 of them, ranging from infants to teenagers. She was thinking about the Jewish family hiding in the storage room behind the false wall, the Goldsteins, who had been there for 8 months and whose youngest daughter had just turned 6 last week. She was thinking about the other nuns, her sisters in Christ, who had begged her not to do this, who had called it suicide, martyrdom without purpose. But Sister Józefa had been certain, with a certainty that transcended logic, that someone had to stand between the tanks and the convent. Someone had to be the physical manifestation of faith, the living symbol that some things were worth defending even when defense seemed impossible. She had volunteered not because she was brave, but because she was terrified of what would happen if no one did anything at all. Inside the lead panzer, the commander was facing a crisis that his years of military training had never prepared him for. The tactical manual had instructions for urban combat, for dealing with artillery fire, for coordinating with infantry units. It had nothing about what to do when a nun refuses to move, and your entire crew is looking at you like you've just asked them to murder their own grandmother. The driver had actually removed his hands from the controls, a small act of mutiny that the commander chose to ignore, because acknowledging it would force him to make decisions he wasn't ready to make. The gunner was crying, silently, tears running down his face, and the radio operator had started praying too, whispering the Lord's Prayer in German, something the commander hadn't heard since basic training. The war had beaten religion out of most of them. You couldn't watch what they had watched, do what they had done, and still believe in a benevolent God. But apparently, you could watch one woman kneel in the road with a rosary, and something dormant, something you thought was dead, could flicker back to life. Behind the panzer, in the second and third vehicles, soldiers were climbing out, ignoring protocol, ignoring the chain of command, because they needed to see this with their own eyes. They needed to understand why their convoy had stopped, why the unstoppable German war machine had been halted by a woman with wooden beads. Some of them recognized what she was holding. Catholic boys from Bavaria and Austria, boys who had served as altar boys before they became soldiers, boys who remembered their mothers and grandmothers praying the Rosary during harvest season and Advent. Others had no idea what it was, just knew it was religious, something sacred, something that belonged to a world that felt impossibly distant from this dirt road in occupied Poland. They stood there, 15 men in the uniforms of the Third Reich, men who had sworn oaths to Hitler and the fatherland, men who had participated in horrors that would define the 20th century, and they stood paralyzed by the sight of one woman refusing to move. The commander finally climbed out of the tank. He had to. The situation had spiraled beyond anything he could control from inside the armored shell, and if he was going to maintain any authority over his men, he needed to confront this directly. He walked toward Sister Józefa, his boots crunching on the gravel road, his hand instinctively moving to the pistol on his belt, not because he intended to use it, but because touching it gave him something to do with his shaking hands. He stopped 3 paces away from her, close enough to see the details of her face, the lines around her eyes, the way her lips moved in silent prayer, the complete absence of fear in her expression. She wasn't performing for an audience. She wasn't trying to be heroic. She was simply genuinely, deeply engaged in prayer, as if the tank and the soldiers and the entire war were secondary to her conversation with God. The commander cleared his throat, intending to order her to move, intending to threaten her, intending to do something that would restore the natural order where soldiers with guns had power and unarmed civilians did not. But when he opened his mouth, what came out was a question he hadn't planned to ask, a question in broken Polish that surprised him as much as it would have surprised anyone who knew him. He asked her what she was praying for. And Sister Józefa Kaliska, without opening her eyes, without pausing in her recitation, answered him. She said she was praying for his soul, for the souls of all his men, and for the souls of everyone in the convent who would die if he gave the order to proceed. She said she was praying that God would remind him of who he was before the war, before the uniform, before he became a man who could contemplate crushing a woman under tank treads. And then she said something that would echo in his mind for the next 40 years, until the day he died in a nursing home in Munich, still haunted by the roads of Poland, She said she forgave him, even though he hadn't asked for forgiveness, even though he hadn't done anything yet that required forgiving. She forgave him in advance because she understood that soldiers rarely chose their wars, and that every man standing on that road was somebody's son. The commander stood frozen, Sister Józefa's words hanging in the air between them like something physical, something he could almost reach out and touch. Forgiveness. The concept felt alien, almost obscene in the context of everything he had done, everything he had witnessed, everything the Wehrmacht and the SS had unleashed across Europe. He had stopped thinking in terms of forgiveness years ago, had compartmentalized his actions into a separate space in his mind labeled duty, labeled survival, labeled necessary evils in service of the fatherland. But hearing this Polish nun say those words, hearing her forgive him for sins he hadn't even committed yet, cracked something open inside him. He thought about his mother, about the last time he had seen her in 1941, how she had pressed her rosary into his hands and begged him to remember his faith, to remember that God was watching even in war. He had left that rosary in a drawer before shipping east, had told himself it was superstition, that modern warfare had no room for medieval relics. Now, staring at the rosary in Sister Józefa's hands, he wondered if his mother was still alive, still praying for him, still believing her son was redeemable. Behind him, the crew and the other soldiers were experiencing their own private reckonings. The young gunner from Bavaria was remembering his first communion, the taste of the wafer on his tongue, the feeling of being pure and forgiven and loved by something greater than himself. That feeling had died somewhere on the road to Stalingrad, buried under the weight of frozen corpses and burning villages, and the screams of people who begged for mercy in languages he didn't understand. But standing here, watching this nun pray with such absolute conviction, he felt a ghost of that old feeling, a whisper that maybe redemption wasn't completely impossible. The driver, a farmer's son from Saxony who had never wanted to be a soldier, was thinking about his own parish priest, Father Heinrich, who had hidden a Jewish family in the church basement until someone betrayed them and the Gestapo came. The driver had been on leave when it happened, had returned to find Father Heinrich hanged in the town square, and the Jewish family gone. He had never forgiven himself for not being there, for not doing something, though what he could have done against the Gestapo he had no idea. Now he had a chance. Now he could choose differently. The silence stretched on, broken only by the idling engine and the whisper of wind through the bare trees lining the road. In the convent, the other nuns were watching through the windows, their prayers intensifying with every second that passed, without the sound of gunfire or the roar of advancing tanks. The Mother Superior had her hand on the shoulder of the youngest nun, a girl barely 20, who had joined the order only 6 months before the war started, and who was shaking so badly her teeth chattered. The children in the cellar were silent, unnaturally silent, the older ones pressing their hands over the mouths of the younger ones who didn't understand why they had to be quiet. The Goldstein family huddled in their hidden room, Mr. Goldstein holding his wife while she held their daughter, all of them barely breathing, listening to the muffled sounds from outside and trying to interpret what the continued silence meant. Hope was a dangerous thing to feel after years of occupation, but it was creeping in despite their best efforts to suppress it. The commander made his decision. He didn't announce it dramatically or explain his reasoning. He simply turned away from Sister Józefa, walked back to his men, and gave orders that contradicted everything in his mission briefing. The convoy would bypass the convent. They would take the western road, add an extra hour to their retreat, and leave this place untouched. When the sergeant questioned the order, pointing out that command had been explicit about destroying all infrastructure, the commander said something about tactical priorities and Soviet advance timelines that made no real sense but provided enough official-sounding justification that the sergeant stopped arguing. The men climbed back into their vehicles without protest, almost eager to leave, as if staying another moment might force them to confront questions they had spent years avoiding. The Panzer's engine revved, gears grinding as the driver maneuvered the massive vehicle into a three-point turn on the narrow road, treads chewing up the dirt, leaving deep scars in the earth, but leaving the nun untouched. Sister Józefa remained on her knees until the last vehicle disappeared around the bend, until the sound of engines faded completely and all that remained was the wind and the birds and the pounding of her own heart. Only then did she open her eyes. Only then did she lower her rosary. Only then did she allow herself to feel the terror that had been coiled tight in her chest for the last 15 minutes. Her legs wouldn't work when she tried to stand. She had been kneeling so long with so much tension that the muscles had locked. She collapsed forward onto her hands, gasping, shaking, and then she was crying. Great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep and primal, the release of fear and relief, and the overwhelming weight of what had just happened. The other nuns came running from the convent, lifting her up, carrying her inside, all of them talking at once, praising God and calling it a miracle. But Sister Józefa Kaliska, in that moment, felt no triumph. She felt only exhaustion and the terrible knowledge that while one convoy had spared them, the war was far from over. The hours following the departure of the German convoy were marked by a strange, fragile peace that no one in the convent quite trusted. The nuns moved through their routines with mechanical precision, tending to the children, preparing the meager evening meal of watery soup and stale bread. But their minds were elsewhere, replaying the scene on the road, trying to understand what had happened and whether it would hold. The Mother Superior ordered the false wall in the storage room to remain sealed, the Goldstein family to stay hidden, because rumors traveled fast in occupied territory, and there was no guarantee that another unit wouldn't arrive with different orders and less merciful commanders. Sister Józefa spent the afternoon in the chapel, not praying this time but simply sitting in silence, staring at the crucifix above the altar, trying to reconcile what she had done with what she had always believed about herself. She had never considered herself brave, had always thought of courage as something loud and dramatic, the kind of thing soldiers displayed in battle. But what she had felt on that road wasn't bravery in any traditional sense. It was something quieter, something closer to resignation, the acceptance that some things mattered more than survival. Word of the incident spread through the local resistance network faster than anyone expected. By nightfall, 3 different messengers had arrived at the convent, each bringing the same question from different partisan cells hiding in the forests. What happened? How did you stop them? Can it be replicated? The resistance had been fighting the Nazis for 6 years with bullets and bombs and sabotage, and here was a nun who had apparently achieved what armed fighters rarely managed, forcing a German unit to change course without firing a single shot. The Mother Superior met with the messengers privately, explaining what Sister Józefa had done, but cautioning against reading too much into it, warning that miracles by definition could not be manufactured or relied upon. But the story was already taking on a life of its own, spreading from village to village, growing more elaborate with each retelling. By the time it reached the partisan commanders in the deep forest, Sister Józefa had stopped not 1 tank but 3, had prayed for an hour instead of minutes, had caused the German commander to fall to his knees and beg forgiveness. Myths were powerful weapons in occupied Poland, and the resistance understood instinctively that the story of the praying nun was worth more than a dozen ambushed supply convoys. The German retreat continued, and the Soviet advance accelerated. Within 3 days, the Red Army reached the outskirts of the region, bringing a different kind of terror, one that wore red stars instead of swastikas, but was no less brutal for the change in ideology. The convent prepared for another siege, another test of faith. But this time the soldiers who arrived were looking for German collaborators and hidden weapons, not for reasons to destroy religious buildings. The Soviet commissar who questioned the Mother Superior was suspicious of the story about the German convoy, called it propaganda, called it impossible, but he had no proof of collaboration, and his orders were to push west, not to waste time investigating nuns. The convent survived the Soviet liberation the same way it had survived the German occupation, by being useful, by treating wounded soldiers regardless of uniform, by feeding anyone who came to the door hungry. Sister Józefa worked alongside the other nuns through those chaotic weeks, caring for Soviet soldiers with frostbite and typhus, never speaking about what she had done on the road, never claiming any special status or recognition. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, just weeks after the incident with the tank. The convent celebrated with a special mass, the first time in 6 years they had been able to worship openly without fear of reprisal. The Goldstein family emerged from their hiding place, blinking in the sunlight, their daughter running into the courtyard for the first time in 8 months. Other families who had been sheltered in the convent's network of safe houses began to return, gathering in the chapel to give thanks, to mourn the dead, to try to make sense of a world that had been fundamentally broken and would never be fully repaired. Sister Józefa participated in all of this, but she remained quiet, almost withdrawn, and those who knew her best could see that something had changed. She had looked death in the face, and death had blinked first, but the cost of that confrontation was a burden she would carry alone. In the months and years that followed, as Poland transitioned from Nazi occupation to Soviet control, as the full horror of the Holocaust became known, as the world tried to rebuild from the ashes of the most destructive war in human history, the story of the nun and the tank became one of thousands of small miracles that people clung to when the larger narratives became too overwhelming. The convent recorded it in their internal chronicles, a simple notation that on April 11, 1945, Sister Józefa Kaliska had confronted a German Panzer division and persuaded them to spare the convent through prayer. No drama, no embellishment, just the facts as they understood them. But facts have a way of fading when they're not reinforced by official histories, when they don't fit neatly into the narratives that nations tell themselves about wars and heroes. The Soviet authorities had no interest in promoting stories about Catholic nuns performing miracles, and the Polish government under communist control actively suppressed religious narratives. So the story survived only in whispers, in family legends, in the fading memories of those who had been there. Sister Józefa Kaliska lived another 42 years after the war ended, spending every single one of them in the same convent, teaching the same lessons, praying the same prayers, maintaining the same quiet routine she had followed since joining the order in 1931. She never spoke publicly about the incident on the road, never wrote about it, never sought recognition or fame. When younger nuns asked her about it, drawn by rumors they had heard from villagers or from the few remaining witnesses, she would smile gently and say that God had been present that day, that prayer had power, and that the details mattered less than the lesson. But in private moments, late at night when sleep wouldn't come, she would lie in her narrow bed and replay those 7 minutes over and over, wondering what would have happened if the commander had made a different choice, wondering if she had truly changed anything, or if the convoy had been planning to bypass the convent all along, and she had simply happened to be kneeling in the road at the right time. Doubt was a constant companion, the shadow side of faith, and Sister Józefa had learned to live with both. The convent itself continued its work through the difficult decades of communist rule in Poland. The new government was openly hostile to the Catholic Church, seeing it as a rival power structure, a source of loyalty that competed with loyalty to the state. Convents were monitored, priests were arrested on fabricated charges, and religious education was banned in public schools. But the nuns adapted, finding ways to teach catechism in secret, to maintain their charitable work under the guise of social services, to preserve their faith in an environment designed to suffocate it. Sister Józefa became one of the elders of the community, respected not for her moment of dramatic confrontation, but for her decades of steady, unglamorous service. She taught generations of children to read and write, helped hundreds of women through difficult births, and provided counsel to families struggling with poverty, addiction, and the moral compromises required to survive under an authoritarian regime. Her life was a testament to the idea that heroism wasn't a single act, but a sustained commitment to doing good in a world that often rewarded the opposite. The German tank commander also survived the war, though his path was far more complicated. He was captured by American forces in late April 1945, just days after abandoning his vehicle when it ran out of fuel during the final chaotic retreat. He spent 3 years in a prisoner of war camp, was eventually released, and returned to a Germany that no longer existed in any form he recognized. His family home had been destroyed in bombing raids. His mother had died during the siege of his hometown. His younger brother had been killed at Normandy. He found work as a laborer, then as a factory supervisor, eventually rebuilding a modest life in the new West Germany. But he never forgot the nun on the road. He told the story once to his wife. years into their marriage after too much schnapps on a winter night when the memories wouldn't stay buried. She listened without judgment, then asked him why he had stopped. He said he didn't know. He said maybe seeing her pray had reminded him of his mother, or maybe he had simply been tired, bone-deep tired of killing and destroying, and the nun had given him an excuse to choose differently. His wife suggested he try to find her, to apologize or seek forgiveness or simply acknowledge what had happened, but he never did. The shame was too heavy, the weight of everything else he had done too overwhelming. Some wounds don't heal. Some debts can't be repaid. By the 1980s, most of the witnesses to the incident had died. The partisan messengers who had spread the story were gone. The German soldiers who had been in the convoy were scattered across West Germany and Austria, most of them choosing silence about their wartime service. The children who had been hiding in the convent cellar had grown into adults with their own families, their own traumas, their own reasons to leave the past buried. The Goldstein family had emigrated to Israel in 1948, taking their memories with them. The story survived in the convent's chronicles and in a few local histories written by amateur scholars, but it never made it into the major historical records of the war. There were too many stories from World War II, too many acts of courage and cowardice and everything in between. One nun stopping one tank on one obscure Polish road couldn't compete with Stalingrad, D-Day, Auschwitz, Hiroshima. The big narratives consumed the small ones, and Sister Józefa's moment of confrontation became a footnote, then a rumor, then nearly forgotten. Sister Józefa Kaliska died in 1987 at the age of 74. Her death was peaceful, a gradual fading after a short illness, surrounded by her sister nuns and several former students who had traveled from across Poland to be present. The local newspaper ran a brief obituary noting her decades of service to the community. The convent held a funeral mass attended by perhaps 200 people. She was buried in the small cemetery behind the chapel, her grave marked with a simple stone cross and her name. No mention was made on the stone of what she had done in April 1945. That story was considered too extraordinary, too subject to embellishment, too difficult to verify. The Mother Superior who had succeeded the original one made the decision to keep the gravestone simple, believing that Sister Józefa herself would have wanted it that way. And perhaps she was right. But in choosing simplicity, in choosing discretion, the Church allowed one of its most remarkable stories to slip toward oblivion. The story might have died completely, if not for an unexpected resurrection in the early 2000s. A German historian named Klaus Weber was researching his grandfather's military service for a family genealogy project when he discovered a letter tucked into an old Bible. The letter had been written by his grandfather in 1946, addressed to no one in particular, never sent, simply written as a form of confession or therapy or perhaps penance. In it, Weber's grandfather described his final weeks on the Eastern Front, the chaos of the retreat, and an incident involving a Polish nun who had knelt in the road and prayed while his convoy sat paralyzed, unable to proceed. The letter was fragmentary, emotionally raw, and it mentioned the approximate location and date. Weber, a professional historian specializing in civilian experiences during the war, recognized immediately that this was something significant, a primary source document describing an event he had never encountered in any official records. He began investigating, starting with German military archives, cross-referencing unit movements with the timeline his grandfather had provided. The German archives yielded little. Most records from the final weeks of the war had been destroyed, either deliberately by retreating forces or lost in the general chaos of Germany's collapse. But Weber was persistent, and he eventually shifted his research to Poland, traveling to the region his grandfather had mentioned, interviewing elderly residents, searching through local church records and convent archives. It took him 3 years of intermittent research, working around his teaching obligations at the university, but he finally found the convent. It was still operational, still home to a small community of nuns, though much diminished from its wartime population. The current Mother Superior listened to his story with cautious interest, then disappeared into the convent's library for nearly an hour. When she returned, she was carrying a leather-bound chronicle, its pages yellowed and fragile, and she opened it to an entry dated April 11th, 1945. There, in precise handwriting, was the record Weber had been searching for, the account of Sister Józefa Kaliska confronting a German Panzer unit and persuading them through prayer to spare the convent. Weber's subsequent academic paper, published in a respected journal of Holocaust and Genocide Studies in 2007, brought the story back from obscurity. He framed it carefully, noting the limitations of the evidence, the impossibility of absolute verification, the likelihood that some details had been embellished or misremembered over the decades. But the core facts were solid enough. The convent chronicle, his grandfather's letter, and interviews with 3 surviving witnesses, all independently corroborating the basic narrative. The paper sparked interest in academic circles, then began filtering out to wider audiences. A Polish filmmaker optioned the story for a documentary that was eventually completed in 2011. A Catholic publishing house released a small biography of Sister Józefa in 2013. The story began appearing in collections of inspirational wartime tales, in blog posts about forgotten heroes, in sermons about the power of faith. But it remained, even with this renewed attention, a relatively obscure piece of history, known primarily to specialists and to people specifically interested in religious responses to the Holocaust. What Weber's research couldn't capture, what no historical document could adequately convey, was the psychological reality of those 7 minutes on the road. The statistics were simple enough: 1 woman, 1 rosary, 15 soldiers, 1 tank, 0 casualties. But the human dimension, the interior experience of the people involved, remained frustratingly opaque. What was Sister Józefa actually thinking as she knelt there? Was she truly at peace, convinced that God would protect her, or was she terrified and simply refusing to show it? What about the tank commander? Was his decision a moment of genuine moral awakening, or was it pragmatic calculation? A realization that destroying a convent full of witnesses might create problems when the Allies arrived. And what about the other soldiers? Were they led by the commander's order to bypass the convent, or did some of them see it as weakness, as the kind of sentimentality that had cost Germany the war? The written records were silent on these questions, and the people who could have answered them were long dead. The truth, as best as historians could reconstruct it, was probably more complicated and more human than either the myth or the skepticism suggested. Sister Józefa had been genuinely faithful, but also genuinely terrified, operating from a combination of conviction and desperation. The tank commander had been conflicted, caught between years of conditioning and a sudden, unexpected surge of conscience triggered by a woman who reminded him of his mother. The other soldiers had been exhausted, morally depleted, looking for any excuse to avoid adding one more atrocity to the long list they were already carrying. None of them were pure heroes or pure villains. They were people trapped in an impossible situation, making split-second choices with incomplete information and overwhelming pressure. The miracle, if there was one, wasn't that God reached down and physically stopped the tank. The miracle was that in the middle of the worst war humanity had ever fought, in a moment when every incentive pointed toward violence, a group of human beings chose mercy instead. That choice was fragile, contingent, unrepeatable, but it was real, and it mattered. The question that haunted Klaus Weber throughout his research, the question that he couldn't answer, despite years of investigation and dozens of interviews, was a simple one. How many times did this happen? How many other convents, how many other priests, how many other ordinary people stood in front of advancing armies with nothing but faith and desperation? And how many of those confrontations ended differently than Sister Józefa's? The archivi. Tears were full of the other outcomes. The villages burned, the churches destroyed. The clergy executed for the crime of being in the wrong place when the wrong soldiers arrived. For every story like Sister Józefa's, there were hundreds where the tank didn't stop, where the prayers went unanswered, where faith proved insufficient against 30 tons of steel and the momentum of institutional evil. Weber documented some of these parallel tragedies in his research, not to diminish what Sister Józefa had accomplished, but to provide context, to show how extraordinary her survival truly was. He found records of a priest in Ukraine who tried the same thing in 1941 and was shot before he could finish his first prayer. He found testimony about a group of nuns in Belarus who formed a human chain across a road and were simply driven over, their bodies left in the dirt as a warning. The miracle wasn't that prayer worked. The miracle was that this one time, with this particular group of soldiers, it worked. The uncomfortable truth that Weber had to wrestle with in his academic paper was the role of chance, of randomness, of factors that had nothing to do with faith or virtue. If the tank commander had been a different person, someone more ideologically committed, or simply more callous, Sister Józefa would have died on that road and the convent would have been destroyed. If the crew had been different, if they had been fresh recruits eager to prove themselves instead of exhausted veterans looking for reasons to avoid more killing, the outcome would have been different. If the Soviets had been 6 hours closer instead of 12, if the tactical situation had been more desperate, if the weather had been different, or the commander's mood had been different, or any of 1,000 other variables had shifted slightly, the story would have ended in tragedy. Sister Józefa had courage, had faith, had made a choice that demanded respect regardless of the outcome. But she had also been extraordinarily lucky in ways she never could have controlled or predicted. That didn't diminish her courage. It just made it human. Weber interviewed the grandchildren of the tank commander in 2006, shortly before publishing his paper. They knew almost nothing about their grandfather's wartime service, only that he had been in the Wehrmacht, that he never talked about it, and that he had died in 1989, 2 years after Sister Józefa. They gave Weber access to his personal effects, including the Bible with the letter and a small wooden box that contained his military decorations, a few photographs, and unexpectedly, a rosary. It was old, the beads worn smooth by decades of handling, and attached to it was a small note in the commander's handwriting. The note said only this: "For my mother, and for the woman on the road." Weber asked if they knew what it meant. They didn't. He showed them his research, explained what their grandfather had witnessed and participated in, told them about Sister Józefa. The revelation was difficult for them, this sudden window into a past their family had worked hard to forget. But they gave Weber permission to include the rosary in his paper, to photograph it as evidence that the incident had continued to haunt the commander for the rest of his life. The rosary became in a way more powerful evidence than any document or testimony. It proved that the encounter on the road had been significant enough that the commander carried a physical reminder of it for 44 years, that he associated it with his mother and her faith, that he never stopped thinking about the choice he had made. Weber wondered if the commander had prayed with the rosary, if he had found comfort in it, or if it served primarily as a form of self-punishment, a reminder of the man he had been before the war and the man he might have become if circumstances had been different. The grandchildren donated the rosary to a Holocaust museum in Berlin after the paper was published. It sits now in a small display case with a placard explaining its history, a tangible connection between a German tank commander and a Polish nun, between the machinery of war and the fragility of conscience, between the worst humanity is capable of and the possibility of redemption. But even with Weber's research, even with the documentary and the biography and the museum display, the story of Sister Józefa Kaliska remained marginal, a footnote to the larger narratives of World War II. It didn't fit comfortably into any of the standard frameworks. It wasn't a story of military strategy or political leadership. It wasn't a story of resistance in the traditional sense. It wasn't a clear-cut morality tale where good triumphed over evil through superior force or cunning. It was messy and ambiguous and dependent on luck and human psychology in ways that made it difficult to extract simple lessons. The tank commander wasn't a hero who defied orders to save innocent people. He was a man who had committed atrocities and then, in one moment, chose not to commit another one. Sister Józefa wasn't a warrior saint who defeated the Nazis through supernatural intervention. She was a terrified woman who prayed and got lucky that the men in front of her were exhausted enough, conflicted enough, human enough to hesitate. Real heroism, real moral courage, is almost always less dramatic and more complicated than the stories we tell ourselves. And that's exactly why this story matters. The convent where Sister Józefa spent her entire adult life still stands today, though it's much changed from its wartime incarnation. The building has been renovated multiple times. The courtyard where children once played while hiding from Nazi patrols is now a small garden with a statue of Mary, and the cellar, where 43 children held their breath in terrified silence, has been converted into storage space for the convent's modest archive. Only 7 nuns live there now, down from the 23 who were present in 1945, a reflection of the broader decline in religious vocations across Europe. They maintain the grounds, offer spiritual counseling to the community, and run a small program providing meals for the elderly. Most visitors to the area have no idea the convent exists, let alone what happened there 8 decades ago. There's no historical marker on the road where Sister Józefa knelt, no monument or plaque explaining that this unremarkable stretch of dirt and gravel was once the site of a confrontation between faith and fascism. The ground remembers nothing. Only the people do, and even that memory is fading. In 2019, a group of filmmakers approached the convent about making a feature film based on Sister Józefa's story. They had read Weber's research, watched the documentary, and believed they could create something powerful and commercially viable, especially for Catholic audiences in Poland and the United States. The current Mother Superior listened to their pitch, reviewed their proposed script, and ultimately declined permission to film on the convent grounds. Her reasoning was simple but profound. She explained that Sister Józefa had spent 42 years after the war living in deliberate obscurity, serving quietly, never seeking recognition for what she had done. To turn her story into entertainment, even respectful entertainment, even entertainment with a clear moral message, would betray the fundamental humility that had defined her life. The filmmakers argued that the story deserved to be known, that it could inspire people, that it could be a counterweight to the overwhelming darkness of Holocaust narratives. The Mother Superior agreed the story deserved to be known, but she insisted it needed to be known in the right way as a historical fact, rather than as dramatic spectacle. The filmmakers eventually made their movie anyway, shooting in a different location with fictionalized characters, and it performed moderately well at Catholic film festivals before disappearing into streaming obscurity. What the Mother Superior understood, what even sympathetic historians sometimes missed, was that the significance of Sister Józefa's action lay not in its drama, but in its ordinariness. She wasn't a superhero or a saint in the traditional miraculous sense. She was a frightened woman who did what she believed was right even when it seemed suicidal, and she got lucky that the men facing her retained enough humanity to be moved by her courage. That's not a story Hollywood knows how to tell because it doesn't have clear villains or triumphant endings or simple moral lessons. The tank commander wasn't defeated or converted. He made one decent choice in a war full of indecent ones, then went home and lived with his guilt until he died. Sister Józefa didn't become famous or powerful. She went back to teaching children and delivering babies and praying her rosary every night. The children in the cellar grew up and scattered, and mostly forgot how close they came to dying. The war ended, and life continued, and the moment on the road became just another memory competing with millions of other memories for space in the historical record. Today, if you visit the convent and ask to see Sister Józefa's grave, the nuns will take you to the small cemetery behind the chapel. Her stone is weathered now, the carved letters harder to read, covered in places by moss and lichen. There are usually flowers on the grave, left by locals who remember her kindly but vaguely, as a good woman who helped their grandparents during hard times. Occasionally, someone who has read Weber's research or seen the documentary will make a pilgrimage specifically to honor her memory, and they'll stand at the grave trying to imagine what kind of person could kneel in front of a tank with nothing but a rosary. But the grave offers no answers. It's just stone and earth and the physical remains of a woman who died 37 years ago. The meaning has to be supplied by the living, and the living, as always, disagree about what that meaning should be. The resistance fighters who spread her story during the war saw her as a symbol of Polish Catholic defiance, proof that faith could triumph over Nazi tyranny. The communist government that followed saw her as irrelevant at best, a relic of superstitious thinking that had no place in the new socialist Poland. The Church saw her as an example of courage and devotion, but stopped short of advocating for sainthood because the incident was too ambiguous, too dependent on the choices of others, too difficult to classify as a genuine miracle. Academic historians saw her as a fascinating case study in the psychology of moral decision-making under extreme pressure. Catholic bloggers and inspirational speakers saw her as proof that God answers prayers and rewards faith. Skeptics saw her as a woman who gambled with her life and happened to win. All of these interpretations contain some truth. None of them contain the whole truth, because the whole truth died with Sister Józefa and the tank commander and everyone else who was present on that road in April 1945. What we're left with is a story that refuses to be simple, that insists on complexity and ambiguity, even when we desperately want it to be inspiring and clear-cut. We're left with a woman who did something extraordinarily brave that might have been extraordinarily foolish if circumstances had been slightly different. We're left with a group of German soldiers who committed atrocities elsewhere but chose mercy once, and the question of whether that single choice redeems them or simply makes their other choices more damning. We're left with the uncomfortable reality that moral courage doesn't always look heroic, that it's often quiet and unglamorous and dependent on factors beyond anyone's control. And we're left with the even more uncomfortable reality that most stories like this one didn't have happy endings, that Sister Józefa's survival was the exception rather than the rule, that faith and courage and moral clarity were usually insufficient weapons against the industrial machinery of genocide. So why does this story matter now? 80 years after Sister Józefa knelt on that dirt road in Poland, why should anyone care about one woman and one tank and one moment of mercy in a war that killed 60 million people and destroyed entire civilizations? The answer lies not in what makes the story exceptional, but in what makes it essential. We live in an age where war feels distant to most people in the West, something that happens on screens or in faraway countries, something abstract and manageable. But Sister Józefa's story reminds us that war is always personal, always a series of individual choices made by individual people who have to live with the consequences. The tank commander wasn't an abstract force of evil. He was someone's son, someone's brother, someone who had been taught right from wrong and then placed in situations where right and wrong became impossibly tangled. Sister Józefa wasn't a marble statue of virtue. She was a terrified teacher who made a choice that could have ended with her death and instead ended with her becoming a footnote in history. Their encounter matters because it shows us that even in the darkest moments, even when every system and institution is pushing people toward cruelty, individual conscience can still assert itself. The story also matters because it challenges our comfortable narratives about heroism and faith. We want to believe that prayer works, that God intervenes to protect the righteous, that courage is always rewarded. Sister Józefa's story seems to confirm those beliefs at first glance. But dig deeper, and the story becomes more complicated. Prayer didn't stop the tank. Human psychology stopped the tank. Exhaustion and guilt and a moment of unexpected identification between a soldier and his memory of his mother stopped the tank. God, if God was present at all, worked through thoroughly human mechanisms, through the messy, contingent reality of people making imperfect choices under impossible pressure. That's a less satisfying narrative than divine intervention, but it's also a more useful one because it places the responsibility for moral action squarely on human shoulders. We can't pray our way out of every crisis, but we can choose, even when the choices are terrible, to hold on to whatever shreds of humanity we have left. The deliberate erasure of stories like Sister Józefa's from mainstream historical consciousness is itself significant. Communist Poland didn't want to remember religious resistance to Nazis because it complicated the narrative of socialist liberation. Post-communist Poland struggled to integrate these stories because they raised uncomfortable questions about collaboration and complicity. Western historians often overlooked them because they were small-scale, because they didn't fit into the grand strategic narratives of how the war was won. But the war wasn't just won by generals and politicians and industrial production. It was survived by millions of ordinary people making small choices every day, choices about whether to help or hurt, to speak or stay silent, to risk or retreat. Sister Józefa's choice was one of millions, and most of those choices are now lost to history. We remember the big battles and the famous speeches, but we forget the woman who knelt in the road and the soldier who decided not to kill her. What happened on that April morning in 1945 wasn't a miracle in the supernatural sense. It was a miracle in the human sense, the kind of miracle that happens when people surprise themselves by being better than they thought they could be. Sister Józefa surprised herself by finding the courage to confront death directly. The tank commander surprised himself by discovering he still had enough conscience to refuse an easy atrocity. The other soldiers surprised themselves by supporting that refusal instead of demanding compliance with orders. These weren't saints or heroes in the mythological sense. They were ordinary people who, for 7 minutes, managed to be extraordinary. And that's the kind of miracle we can actually learn from, because it's the kind of miracle that's available to all of us, if we're willing to pay attention to our conscience when it whispers that something is wrong, even when every external pressure is telling us to ignore it. Sister Józefa Kaliska died in obscurity, was buried without fanfare, and spent decades being forgotten by everyone except a few nuns and local villagers who remembered her kindness. But her story, the real story, stripped of embellishment and mythology, is exactly the kind of story we need right now. We need stories that remind us that individual action matters, that moral courage doesn't require supernatural powers or institutional support, that the choice to do the right thing is always available even when the cost might be catastrophic. We need stories that show us the full complexity of human behavior, the reality that people aren't divided cleanly into heroes and villains, but are instead complicated mixtures of courage and cowardice, virtue and vice, selfishness and compassion. And we need stories that have been deliberately erased or forgotten, because those stories often contain truths that powerful institutions would prefer remained buried. Sister Józefa knelt in the road with a rosary, and a tank stopped. That's the simple version. The complicated version is that a woman gambled her life on the possibility that the men facing her retained some measure of humanity, and she was right, and her courage made that humanity visible to them in a way it might not have been otherwise. That's the story. That's why it matters, and that's why you needed to hear it.